The candle on the window ledge had burned low, and the room around it was full of noise that Cecily Harwood had long since learned to stop hearing. She stood apart from the card tables, one hand resting on the sill, and told herself she had come to the velvet ribbon because it had been catching on the brooch at her collar all evening. That was all. She reached up and drew the locket from beneath the edge of her bodice, the black enamel warming in her fingers as it always did, and she opened it toward the light. The face inside was not Edmund's. She did not breathe. She did not move. The miniature was small, no larger than a sovereign, painted with the kind of detail a skilled craftsman produces when the commission is generous. Dark eyes, a high, wide brow. The set of a mouth she recognized, though she had never before seen it. Reduced to this scale, she had worn Cornelius Vane's portrait at her throat for 7 months. The noise of the Alderton drawing-room pressed against her from behind, laughter and the clatter of cards and someone's third recounting of the Hartley engagement, and Cecily closed the locket with a sound she felt certain everyone in the room must have heard, though no one turned. Her fingers were steady. She noted this with something like wonder. Across the room near the fireplace, where the light was better and the company was thinner, a man stood with his back half turned to the card tables. He was watching her. He had been watching her, she understood, for longer than the moment she had looked up. She did not know his name yet. She knew only that he had not looked away when her eyes met his, and that his expression, as he held her gaze across the width of that crowded room, was not the polite blank that men of rank usually offered a widow in her position. It was something far more particular than that. She looked back at the candle, and her hand did not shake. And she thought, 7 months. If you have ever carried a grief you did not fully understand, stay with this story. The truth Cecily was about to speak had been building for 7 months inside a black enamel oval, the size of a sovereign, and the woman who was about to speak it had been told, by everyone whose opinion was supposed to matter, that she had nothing left worth protecting. Edmund Harwood had died on the 5th of November in the year prior, on the road between his London offices and the house in Surrey where Cecily had been waiting. With supper kept warm and a letter she had composed and recomposed 3 times because she could not quite find the words for what she wanted to say. She had been working up to telling him that she was content. Not merely resigned, not merely managing, content. It seemed important, after 2 years of a marriage that had asked more of her than she had expected, to say that plainly. The letter was never sent. The carriage came instead, and then the surgeon, and then the quiet procedural machinery of a sudden death, the solicitor, the letters of condolence on good paper, the black gowns ordered from the seamstress who had measured her for her wedding dress 3 years before. Edmund had been 41, a merchant of moderate prosperity and considerable decency, a man whose conversation ran to wool prices and drainage improvements and the particular habits of the birds he watched from his study window. He had not been a romantic figure. He had not swept her from a ballroom. He had, across 3 years of a working marriage, been kind to her in ways she had not always noticed until they were absent, and she had missed him with the quiet thoroughness of missing a good habit. What she had not been prepared for was Cornelius Vane. He had appeared at the funeral with perfect propriety. Edmund's business partner of 11 years, a man she had met perhaps 6 times, always on the edges of the conversations about trade that she had been gently and efficiently excluded from. He had been gracious, measured, the sort of man who knows exactly how to hold himself at a graveside. He wore his grief in the correct register, not too much and not too little, the way expensive cloth sits on a man who has learned which tailor to use. He had spoken warmly of Edmund. He had pressed her hand in the receiving line and said, with every appearance of sincerity, that Edmund had spoken of her often, and always with admiration. She had been, at that moment, too deep in the particular numbness of the newly bereaved to register anything except the sensation of too many hands and too many condolences in an overheated room. She had thanked him and released his hand and turned to the next guest, and she had not thought about Cornelius Vane again until 3 weeks later, when he arrived at the house in Surrey with a solicitor's letter and a proposal. Not a proposal of marriage. Something more subtle than that. He wished, he said, to protect her interests. The Harwood accounts were, he explained delicately, in a degree of difficulty that he had hoped to spare her. Edmund had extended himself rather heavily in the last year. Certain investments had not performed as expected, and there were obligations that would require careful management. He, Cornelius Vane, would be glad to shoulder that management as a mark of his respect for his late partner's memory. He had sat in Edmund's chair while he said all of this. She had noticed that. She had not remarked upon it, because a woman in mourning, remarking upon a man's presumption in occupying the chair of the recently deceased, is not a woman likely to be taken seriously, and she had understood already even then that being taken seriously was going to be the central difficulty of the next several months. She had listened, with her hands folded and her eyes on the window, and she had thanked him, and she had asked for time to consider. He had smiled and said she could have as much time as she required, and had taken the solicitor and the letter with him when he left. She had waited 3 days until she was certain the numbness had receded enough to trust her own reading. Then she had located Edmund's private correspondence, which was kept in a locked secretary in his study, and which she had always had the key to, because Edmund had operated on the principle that there was no reason two people who trusted each other should keep separate secrets. She had made herself a pot of tea from the kitchen, rather than calling for one, because she did not want Mrs. Holt in the room while she read, and she had sat with those letters for 4 days. What she found had not in the end surprised her as much as it should have. Edmund had been suspicious of the accounts for 8 months before his death. He had written of it in careful, understated language to 2 men. His solicitor, who had been slow to respond, and another man, an earl whose name appeared twice, and whose reply, if any had arrived, was not among the papers. She had not pursued the earl. She had not known his name from those letters alone, and she had no means of approach that would not expose her inquiry before she was ready. Instead, she had begun to do what Edmund himself had done. She had read the numbers. The locket had arrived during that same week, a gift from Vane, accompanied by a note expressing his sorrow that she had no portrait of Edmund in miniature form. He had taken the liberty, he wrote, of commissioning one from the artist, who had painted Vane himself last spring. He hoped it would bring her some comfort. She had thanked him. She had pinned it to its velvet ribbon, and worn it at her collar, and gone on reading the numbers. She had not thought to open it. It was, she had told herself, too painful. The portrait would look like Edmund and she would cry, and crying was something she permitted herself only on Tuesday mornings in the half-hour before Mrs. Holt arrived, and it seemed important to ration the occasions. Agnes Holt had come with the house. She was 60-something stout, and possessed of the particular kind of directness that manifests in people who have spent decades in service, and decided somewhere along the way that deference was not the same as honesty. She had examined the locket on the day of its arrival with the expression of someone who had opened a jar and found it improperly sealed. "Have you looked inside it, Mrs. Harwood?" she had asked. "Not yet," Cecily had said. "I find I cannot quite manage it." Mrs. Holt had made a sound that Cecily had interpreted as sympathy, and filed away somewhere at the back of her memory, because she had been in the middle of a column of figures and could not afford distraction. She understood now, standing at the Alderton window with the locket warm in her closed hand, that Mrs. Holt had known, or suspected, or seen something in that small black oval that Cecily had been too deep in grief and numbers to examine. 7 months! She had carried the wrong face for 7 months. She needed a moment. She gave herself exactly the length of time it took for the candle to gutter and resettle, and then she straightened her spine and prepared to return to the room. "How long have you worn that locket?" The voice came from just behind her left shoulder, and it was not the voice of anyone she recognized. Low and level and devoid of the particular social inflation that most men applied when addressing a woman at a party. She turned. The man from across the room was closer than she had expected, standing at a distance that was respectful but barely so, with a quality of presence that very tall people sometimes carry, an awareness of the space they occupy. He was perhaps 34, dark-haired, with a jaw that suggested he had made a habit of keeping his own counsel, and he was watching her with an expression she could not name precisely. Not pity, not curiosity, not the social performance of concern. Something more like recognition, "I beg your pardon," she said, because she had not been introduced to him and the question was a considerable liberty, and she was still holding the locket. "I knew Edmund Harwood," he said. "We were not well acquainted, but I knew him. He mentioned his wife in a letter I received some months ago." He paused. He said she read the account books herself, that she was the only person besides himself who noticed when a column was misaligned. Cecily looked at him. "That is a very specific thing to remember." "It is a very specific thing to have written," he said. "A man who trusts his wife with his numbers is a man who trusts his wife." Across the room, not far from the card tables, she heard Cornelius Vane speaking to his daughter in the low, carrying tone of a man accustomed to controlling a room without seeming to. "She has nothing left to protect," he said, with the patience of someone explaining an obvious thing. "She is a widow, and her husband's debts are sufficient to absorb whatever inconvenience her sentimentality produces. Let her grieve. She will sign in the spring." She did not turn. Neither did the man beside her, though she suspected he had heard it. "You have not answered my question," he said. "You have not introduced yourself," she said. There was a pause. "Thomas Fenwick," he said. "Earl of Ashmore." She knew the name. 2 letters in Edmund's hand, addressed to this man. She looked at him steadily for a long moment, and the thing she had suspected about his expression resolved itself into something clearer. He was not at this party by accident. 7 months, she said. His jaw moved very slightly. "Then you have only just opened it." "Yes." He said nothing further. He looked at the locket in her hand, and then he looked at her face, and she had the discomforting sensation of being seen quite accurately by someone who had not yet decided what to do with the information. He excused himself before she could say anything more. He did not return to the fireplace. The supper room was quieter, lit by fewer candles, and populated by the guests who had come to eat rather than to perform, and Cecily had found her way there not because she was hungry, but because the noise of the drawing room had begun to feel like a physical pressure, and she needed to think. She sat at the far end of the long table with a plate she did not intend to eat from, and Edmund's letters in her reticule beside her chair, and she watched Cornelius Vane move through the drawing room on the other side of the connecting door. He was good at this. She had noticed that early in her widowhood, and been almost admiringly helpless in the face of it. He knew exactly how to position himself in a room, how to make his conversations appear spontaneous, how to arrange his features in the precise expression of a man burdened by responsibility rather than advantaged by it. He had been managing her perception of him for 7 months, and he had been good at it, and she had been paying close enough attention to her grief and her numbers that she had not, until now, thought to look at the locket. "Miss Vane said it this evening," said Mrs. Holt's voice at her elbow, and Cecily turned to find the older woman settling into the chair beside her with a plate of her own. Mrs. Holt had been invited as her companion for the evening, which was a circumstance Cecily had understood was necessary, and which she had been quietly grateful for, to Mrs. Alderton's niece, the young one with the yellow shawl. Said her father's situation is straightforward, and that you were a widow with nothing left to protect, and that the spring would settle things. When did she say this? An hour passed before supper. I was behind the pillar. She did not see me. Cecily looked at her plate. She said it as though it were common understanding. "It is common understanding," Mrs. Holt said, with the precise candor that was her primary gift. "It is what everyone in this room believes, Mrs. Harwood. It is what they have been told." Cecily nodded. She had understood this. The part she was still working through was how to replace it with the truth in a room full of people who had no reason to receive the truth graciously, and in doing so, avoid the outcome that Vane had been maneuvering her toward for months. She felt the Earl of Ashmore sit down on her other side before she turned to look at him. He had a glass of wine, he did not appear to be drinking, and an expression that suggested he had made a decision. He placed a single folded paper on the table beside her plate, smoothed it with 2 fingers, and withdrew his hand. She looked at it without picking it up. It was a copy of a letter, written in a hand she did not recognize. dated 14 months prior. It contained figures. It contained dates. Contained the name Cornelius Vane and a set of numbers that precisely matched the discrepancy she had found in Edmund's accounts. There are 37 more, the Earl said, his voice too low to carry. My solicitor Croft has them. My solicitor Croft has them. I have been waiting until I had a witness willing to stand in the same room as Vane and not be outranked by him. She looked at him. You believe I am that witness? I believe, he said carefully, that Edmund Harwood's widow, who has been carrying that man's portrait at her throat for 7 months, and who has read the account books and noticed every misalignment, is the only witness whose standing in this specific dispute cannot be argued away. You are the widow. The estate is yours. The letters were written to you as beneficiary. No one will credit a widow against a prosperous merchant. No, he said, not alone. She looked at the paper again. Then she looked at him. He was watching her without the performance of reassurance, which she found, unexpectedly, more convincing than reassurance would have been. He was simply waiting. He replaced the miniature, she said. He went into Edmund's study before the funeral or after it, and he took Edmund's portrait from the locket and he put his own inside it. Either he assumed I would never open it, or he wanted me to carry it and not know as a kind of private joke. Or both. Both, the Earl said. He is that kind of man. She picked up the paper. She read it twice. The figures were precise, the dates were precise, and the name Cornelius Vane appeared 4 times in 11 lines in a context that no legitimate account document had produced in 7 months of looking. He wrote to you because he did not trust the solicitor, she said. He believed the solicitor had been persuaded to look away. He was correct, the Earl said, and you wrote back. She set the paper down with great care. Your reply arrived on the 7th. His hands, she observed, were very still on the table. He had the kind of stillness that is not tranquility, but its exact reverse, a considerable amount of motion held precisely in place by long practice. Edmund died on the 5th, he said. 2 days before my letter. I had taken longer than I should have to verify what I was telling him, because I did not wish to alarm him without certainty, and in taking that time I gave Vane the window he required. She looked at him directly. You have been carrying that since November. Yes. And you have been watching me in the months since to determine whether I had any knowledge of what Edmund suspected, whether I was party to it. There was a brief silence, which she recognized as honesty rather than evasion. I did not know your position, he said. Edmund described your understanding of the accounts, but I did not know what Vane had told you, or whether the arrangement he is currently proposing began in some understanding between the two of you before Edmund died. He paused. I was uncertain of you, Mrs. Harwood. I am not uncertain of you now. She absorbed this. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could not object to it on principle. She had herself spent 7 months uncertain of everyone, and she had not given any man in London sufficient evidence to form a clear conclusion about her. She had been careful about exactly that. He had been careful in the same direction, and their separate cautions had run nearly parallel for months, without once intersecting. You are telling me this now, she said, because Vane is about to move. He has the document. He will produce it tonight or at the next occasion, and once he produces it in the right company, the question becomes too complicated to resolve without a public scene. He looked at her steadily. I would rather the public scene was of our choosing. She looked down at the paper again. There was a part of her that was very tired, the specific part that had been holding this alone for 7 months in the sitting room in Surrey, with the account books spread on the table and the candle burning low, the part that was accustomed to being the only person in the room who understood what the number said. She recognized with some care the sensation of a weight becoming slightly more distributable. It was not the same as setting the weight down. It was more useful than that. She understood, then, what she was agreeing to, and she understood that she was agreeing to it not because the Earl had asked her to, but because Edmund had read the same numbers, and Edmund had written to this man. And the letter had arrived 2 days too late. She wondered whether the Earl knew she understood that. She thought he probably did. He reached for his wine glass and did not drink from it, and she thought that was as close to asking her to forgive him as he would allow himself to come. And she thought also that it was honest. And that honesty in a man who could have offered her far easier things was not nothing. It should be said here, if you have stayed this long, that Cecily Harwood had not expected this evening to produce anything beyond an opportunity to observe Cornelius Vane in public and confirm what she already suspected. She had not expected the locket. She had not expected the Earl. She had not expected to feel. Sitting in the Alderton supper room with a glass of wine, she was also not drinking. The particular quality of attention that this man had trained on her, which was the attention of someone who has been looking for something for a long time and had just found it in an unexpected place, and was not yet certain what to do with the finding. She did not let herself think about that. She put it somewhere careful and returned to the numbers. The evening had moved through its paces, and the drawing room was more settled, the card games reaching their conclusions, the conversations sorting themselves into the smaller, quieter clusters that preceded departure, when Cornelius Vane found his moment. He had a document. She understood this before he produced it, because she had been watching him speak to Mr. Alderton for the past quarter hour, with the particular tilt of his head that preceded a performance. And she had been watching the Earl of Ashmore stand at the edge of the room, with the stillness of someone who was not, in fact, still. Vane raised his voice just enough to carry. He was addressing Mr. Alderton, and by extension the room. The document, he said, was the settlement agreement that the late Mr. Harwood's estate had produced in consultation with his widow. It had, he was pleased to say, been signed in October past. Mrs. Harwood had agreed, in that agreement, to transfer the remaining Harwood assets to a trust administered by Vane himself in exchange for the resolution of the estate's outstanding obligations. He was, he said, only sorry. It had taken so long to bring the matter to its conclusion, but he had wanted to give Mrs. Harwood every opportunity to recover from her grief before troubling her with business. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a thing everyone has been expecting, arranged in advance, and now simply confirmed. Cecily did not look at the Earl. She did not look at Mrs. Holt. She looked at Cornelius Vane. "I did not sign that document," she said. Her voice carried without effort, which surprised her. She had not practiced it. It had simply come out at the right level, the way a note does when the instrument has been properly tuned. Vane smiled. He had a warm smile, a useful one. "Mrs. Harwood," he said with a gentleness calibrated to the volume of the room, "you were, if you will forgive me, in considerable distress in October. It is perhaps understandable that you do not recall every business matter you attended to during that period. I did not sign that document," she said again. "The signature is quite clear," he said, and there was no more gentleness in his voice now, only the thin edge underneath it that he had always kept well concealed. "You have nothing left to protect, my dear. Let us not make the end of this unpleasant." Across the room she heard Miss Vane say something to the woman beside her, low and carrying, "A widow with nothing left to protect." As though this were simply the established fact of the matter, repeated now for the benefit of anyone who had missed it the first 2 times. The Earl of Ashmore turned his head and looked at something near the door. Cecily thought, for one cold moment, that he had decided that the cost was too high, or the scene too public, or the risk to his own position too significant, and that the paper in her reticule and the 37 letters in his solicitor's keeping would remain exactly where they were, and she would be a widow in a room full of people who had already been told what she was. She opened her reticule. She had not planned it precisely this way, but the plan she had been assembling for 3 months had always had this shape at its center. And she understood, as she drew Edmund's letters out and placed them on the nearest surface, which was the card table that no one was using, that the plan had never required anyone to do this for her. "These are letters from my husband," she said, "to no one in particular and to everyone," which was a skill she had not known she possessed until this moment, "written in the last 8 months of his life. They document a discrepancy in the Harwood accounts that he had identified and was in the process of confirming." She opened the locket, She held it up so the candlelight could reach the miniature. "This locket was given to me by Mr. Dell Vane 3 weeks after my husband's funeral. He told me it contained my husband's portrait. It does not?" The room was very quiet. "It contains Mr. Vane's portrait," she said. "I have worn it for 7 months. I have been grieving while wearing the face of the man who ruined my husband's estate and who has since forged my signature on a settlement document." She placed the locket beside the letters. She stood up straight. She had expected noise. What she received was silence, which was in some ways more useful. Cornelius Vane's composure was, she had to admit, considerable. It did not crack all at once. It broke at one point first, a tightening around the eyes that she recognized from 7 months of watching him manage difficult conversations, and then, at a second point, a quality of stillness in his hands that was not his usual stillness, but the stillness of someone who has been interrupted mid-step on a familiar road and cannot immediately calculate the alternative route. "That is a grave accusation," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Thomas Fenwick, Earl of Ashmore, walked across the room. He did not cross it quickly. He crossed it the way a man crosses a room when he has made a decision and has no interest in performing that decision for the benefit of onlookers, with a particular weight of certainty that does not require velocity. He stopped beside Cecily, not before her, not between her and Vane, but beside her, shoulder level with her shoulder, facing Vane directly. At the door she saw a man she did not recognize, with a leather satchel under his arm. He had the steady, unhurried quality of a solicitor. He was Mr. Croft. The Earl of Ashmore looked at Cornelius Vane. "Mrs. Harwood's testimony stands," he said, "and Vane's accounts do not." 10 words. She counted them afterward, when she had the quiet to count anything, because she had understood that in this particular room with this particular audience, 10 words delivered by an earl in a voice that carried without effort were worth more than an hour of argument. Miss Lavinia Vane said something very quietly. Her father did not respond. Mr. Croft opened his satchel. The Alderton drawing room rearranged itself around the event, which is what drawing rooms have always done with occasions that exceed their original function. Mr. Alderton called for the document to be examined. Alderton called for more candles. Several guests found reasons to drift toward the card table where Edmund's letters lay. The solicitor produced account books and placed them on the table beside the letters, with the unhurried precision of a man who has prepared a great deal for this moment. Vane did not speak again for a long time. When he did, his voice had changed in some way that Cecily could not quite name, as though a string in an instrument had been cut and the remaining strings were compensating. He spoke to his solicitor, who had appeared from somewhere else in the room, in low, hurried language that produced no visible result. His daughter stood with her hand still in her lap, and her face arranged very carefully in the expression of someone who does not yet know what expression is required. The examination took the better part of an hour. Cecily sat for most of it in the chair she had returned to, with Mrs. Holt on one side and the locket on the table before her. The Earl of Ashmore stood at the edge of the assembled group, not performing his presence, simply occupying it, and occasionally answered questions put to him by Mr. Grott. Alderton in the level, declarative way that seemed to be his primary register for most situations. By the time the carriages were called for, Cornelius Vane had agreed, in the presence of 3 witnesses, to submit his accounts to independent audit. He had not done so with grace. He had not been invited to do so with grace. The night air outside the Alderton house was cold and sharp, and smelled of frost and coal smoke, and Cecily stood at the top of the steps and let it reach her throat. She heard the Earl of Ashmore's footstep on the stone behind her and did not turn. "Your carriage is next," he said. "I know." She was looking at the street, at the torches and the horses and the coachman's breath making small clouds in the cold. "You sent for Croft before the evening began." "I sent for him this afternoon," he said, "when I learned you had been invited." She turned then. He was standing close enough that she had to look up at him slightly, which was a sensation she was not accustomed to and which she found to her considerable inconvenience that she did not object to. "You could have told me," she said, "when you sat down in the supper room." "I did not know," he said, "whether you were ready to stand in that room and say what you said." She considered this. "And if I had not been?" Then Croft would have gone home with his satchel, and we would have found another evening. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had first noticed across the Alderton drawing-room. Direct and specific and entirely without performance. "But I thought you were ready. The way you held that locket when you opened it, the way you closed it." She did not speak for a moment. Behind her she heard Mrs. Selim Holt descending the steps to speak to the coachman, giving them a moment that the older woman had clearly intended to give them. "Edmund wrote to you," she said, "8 months before he died." "You?" wrote back. "Yes." "Your reply arrived 2 days after he did." Something moved through his face. It was brief and controlled, and she recognized it as grief, which was a thing she knew how to recognize. "Yes," he said. She had been carrying a small, careful anger about this for the weeks since she had read Edmund's letters and found the Earl's name. She had been saving it, the way one saves a question one does not yet have the courage to ask. Standing in the cold night air with the frost on the stones, and this man's grief visible in his face, she found that the anger had changed into something else. Not forgiveness, because that was too large a word for a night that had already been large enough. Something quieter than that. An acknowledgement. "He trusted you," she said. "He wrote to you because he thought you would understand the numbers." "He was right," the Earl said. "And you did too slowly," he said. There was no performance in it. It was simply the truth, held without mitigation. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she held out her hand. He took it, and the touch was brief and proper, and entirely within the bounds of what the cold night and the gathered coachman and Mrs. Holt's proximity permitted. Gloved hand inside gloved hand at the top of a stone staircase, and she was acutely and involuntarily aware of the warmth of it through 2 layers of kid leather, and the way that awareness moved from her hand to her wrist before she had time to instruct it otherwise. She retrieved her hand. He did not hold it longer than was correct. She retrieved her hand. The warmth of it remained in her wrist for a moment after, which was the body's own accounting, beyond instruction. "Cecily," he said quietly, without preface, the first time he said her name. She had known from reading Edmund's letters that he was a man who said names deliberately, who had thought before he spoke, for as long as she could trace his written voice. She had known this and been braced for it, and it still arrived with the particular quality of a note struck in a room that has been silent long enough to make the sound distinct. She did not answer. She did not need to. She was aware in the few seconds that followed of exactly where he was standing relative to herself, the precise distance between his shoulder and hers, the sound of his breathing in the cold air, the quality of attention that had not shifted since the moment she had opened the locket at the window and found his face across the room. It was the awareness of someone who has spent 7 months being the only person in the room who knew what they knew, and has now, unexpectedly, encountered someone who knows the same thing. The carriage came forward, and she descended the steps, and Mrs. Holt was there with the door and the step, and Cecily turned once, briefly, and he was standing where she had left him. She did not quite let herself look at him directly. She looked at the general shape of him, dark coat against the lit doorway, and then she got into the carriage, and the door closed. Mrs. Holt settled across from her with the contained satisfaction of someone who has been right about something for a long time. She said nothing. She had the good sense, that woman, to understand when silence was the correct form of communication. Cecily held the locket in her lap all the way home. The fire in the sitting room was banked low when they arrived, and she asked Mrs. Proffin, Holt, to leave it and bring a candle. Instead, she sat at the writing table and opened the locket. One final time, she looked at Vane's face for a long moment. Then she set it down and opened the small drawer beneath the table's surface, the drawer that held Edmund's first letter to her, written in his quick, compact hand 3 days before their wedding, and preserved there because she had decided, quite early in the marriage, that the things which were genuinely worth keeping should be kept well. She found, behind the letter, the small watercolor miniature that Edmund had painted himself the summer before their wedding, badly and cheerfully, sitting for it in the garden with his sister directing him to hold still and him laughing at the instruction. It was Edmund's own face, recognizable in the way that amateur portraits are recognizable when the sitter is well loved, not precisely accurate, but true. She worked the velvet lining loose from Vane's miniature with the small scissors from the sewing box, removed it, and pressed Edmund's in its place. It did not quite fit, because Edmund had not been painted at regulation miniature scale. She pressed the locket, closed around it anyway. Then she set the locket in the drawer on top of the letter. She would not wear it tomorrow. She was not certain she would ever wear it again. The grief it had been designed to carry was finished now, resolved not into absence, but into the cleaner thing on the other side of it. A knowledge of what had been real and what had not. A room in her chest that had been occupied for 7 months by someone else's face and was now quietly her own again. She sat with the candle for a little while. She thought about numbers. She thought about the particular quality of a voice saying her name across a cold staircase. She thought about Edmund, who had trusted her with his accounts and his letters, and the fact of his suspicion, and who had been, in this as in most things, right about what she would need. She thought about the warmth in her wrist that had not entirely gone. It was an inconvenient thought, and she did not pursue it further. She was a widow, and the widow's period of inconvenient thoughts had not yet properly begun. There was an audit to be arranged and a solicitor to write to and 37 letters to be copied and organized and formally submitted. There was a great deal of work still to be done. There was also, she supposed, spring. She blew out the candle. Outside the window the frost was settling on the garden stones, and the night was very still. And it was, she thought, a decent beginning. If this story sat with you this evening, leave a thought below. Cecily found the truth inside a locket, and that is where every reckoning begins.